welcome to all of you for the second of these lectures on the theme of great advocates. And a particularly warm welcome, first of all, to all of those of you who are joining us on the live stream, and an especial welcome here in the hall to the students who've come from York University to join us this evening. We hope that this will be the first of many times that you engage with the Inn and that you have a really good evening with us this evening. And I hope to come round and meet as many of you as I possibly can. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Geraldine Andrews. I am the treasurer of the Inn this year. In the daytime, I am a Lady Justice of the Court of Appeal. And by night, I preside over functions such as these. And one of the great perks is you get to choose a number of things, including the topics for the mixed messes dining. When I thought about this idea, it occurred to me that it would be remiss not to include amongst great advocates a great female advocate. When we hear of great advocates, we don't often immediately think of women, but certainly in my recent experience, some of the best advocates I've heard have been women. And there is no doubt whatsoever, and I don't use that word ill-advisedly. Rose Heilbron was as brilliant as she was beautiful. She was very much a celebrity at a time when we didn't have social media and we didn't have all of the usual online communications, but the press loved her, and for very good reason. She forged a remarkable career as a result of extraordinary talent. She was the first female treasurer of this inn just before I joined it. And she was one of the first female King's Counsel. I'm happy to say that she was the first female recipient of a Lord Justice Holker Scholarship, which is another thing in which I succeeded her because I too was a Holker Scholar many, many years later. She was the first female to lead in a murder trial, the first female judge when she was appointed as the Recorder of Burnley, the first female Commissioner of Assize, the first female to sit as a judge at the Old Bailey, only the second female High Court judge, and of course the first female treasurer of any of the Inns of Court, which of course is ours. And Grays, we always like to think that we punch above our weight. And so that's yet another one of our pioneering achievements. And I'm delighted to be able to say that this lecture is going to be delivered by Rose's daughter, Hilary, who I've had the great privilege of knowing for all my practicing career. Hilary, like me, was a commercial barrister, practiced from Brick Court Chambers, and she is now one of the foremost of the arbitrators that we appoint in international disputes around the world. She travels extensively, and she too is a bencher of this inn. She has written what I would recommend to you as the definitive work about her mother's life, an autobiography entitled Rose QC, the story of England's first woman Queen's Counsel and Judge. It was published in 2019. I've got a copy on my bookshelf. I would commend it to all of you. I'm sure it's still available at Wildys and all good booksellers. And without further ado, may I please invite Hilary to come and talk to you about her distinguished mother and her career. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Geraldine, for those kind words about not only me, but also my mother. And good evening to everyone who I can see in the hall and also those who I can't see online. It's always a great pleasure for me as a proud daughter to speak about my mother, particularly to an audience who may only have seen her lovely portrait by June Mendoza outside the large pension room where we were just having a drink, or passed by the door to the Rose Heilbron room en route to the Bridge Bar, and hopefully are intrigued to know a little more about her. My mother first became acquainted with Gray's Inn when, as you heard, she won the Lord Justice Holker Scholarship in November 1935. That's almost 90 years ago, following being awarded a first-class honours LLB degree from Liverpool University earlier that year. Without that scholarship, she could not have afforded to come to the bar. And Gray's Inn, as many of you know, has a special connection with the north of England and particularly the Northern Circuit. And presumably that is what led her to choose Gray's Inn. And throughout her life, she had a strong affinity with Gray's Inn, and for the last 30 years of it, making it her home. But Gray's Inn, when she joined, was a very different place. When I look around today and see all the women here, when my mother was here, she would probably have been the only woman in the room. Maybe occasionally there was another woman. It was very much a man's world. And from the day of joining Gray's Inn, she blazed a trail. And that's not surprising that it was a man's world, because just to reflect a moment, it was not until the Sex Disqualification Removal Act in 1919, some 16 years earlier than my mother coming to the bar, that women could even enter the profession and thus become lawyers. And prior thereto, not only could they not become lawyers, they couldn't vote, they didn't have equal rights as parents over children, they couldn't appear on juries, just to name a few of the handicaps to progression. And women had just emerged from the Victorian era, when they had been regarded as inferior beings, subjugated to their husbands, and where perhaps the attitude to women is epitomized by Queen Victoria herself, who in a letter to someone called Theodore Martin wrote, "The Queen is most anxious to enlist everyone who can speak or write to join in checking this mad, wicked folly of women's rights, with all its attendant horrors on which the poor feeble sex is bent, forgetting every sense of womanly feeling and propriety. It is a subject which makes the Queen so furious that she cannot contain herself." And so it's that sort of background that my mother started with when she came to the bar a few years later. And even in 1918, the Income Tax Act classified married women as incapacitated persons along with infants and lunatics. So stepping back a few years, this was the world into which my mother was born in 1914. She was born in Liverpool, where I grew up too. History doesn't relate why she chose the bar as a profession, but obviously it was a natural outlet for her talents. She was called to the bar in May 1939, her mother having died at a tragically young age the previous year. And it was then that she came up against the first prejudice against women. Women in those days were discouraged from coming to the bar because of their alleged small voices and high-pitched tones, a criticism which couldn't be leveled against my mother, as she had a trained voice as a result of elocution lessons as a child, and so she was able to modulate and project her voice. Trying to get pupillage proved difficult, and she was rebuffed on more than one occasion, epitomized by the letter from Liverpool University's former Dean of the Faculty of Law, a Professor Batt, who ironically himself was a great supporter of my mother, when he wrote to her thus: "Further consideration on the matter of your reading in chambers with me has led to considerable difficulties. Mr. Fraser Harrison feels unable to make an offer to take you for the latter 6 months or offer at any time, and I have a definite feeling that the other men in these chambers and the clerk would not welcome a woman pupil." She did eventually find pupillage with someone called Dick Trotter, who was then a county court judge, what you would now call a circuit judge. A confirmed bachelor, it was alleged by some wag that they lived in forensic sin. The beginning of her career at the bar coincided with the outbreak of the Second World War. Her talent, both as a lawyer and as an inspiring advocate, was soon recognized. And it was only about a year into practice that a local solicitor commented to a local newspaper, "There's no doubt about it. To borrow a phrase from Hollywood, she will be a sensation in 4 or 5 years' time." My mother was beautiful, and she was also very photogenic. And so she made, as you heard, good press copy, coupled with the fact that what she was doing for the most part had never been done before. She was thus a bit of a novelty. So everything that she did, such as the first appearance at a police court, what you would now call a magistrate's court, would attract column interests. So for example, on one occasion, the Daily Post, which was the local Liverpool daily newspaper, said, "History has just been made today at Liverpool law courts by a woman barrister who, during a case in which she was not personally engaged, sat in the barristers' benches without a wig or a hat, because in those days you weren't allowed into court without a hat if you weren't a member of the bar." Alongside these more trivial incidents, my mother was making her mark. Her undoubted eloquence and legal ability enabled her to build a large junior practice, and along the way started the roll call of firsts, which she achieved in her career. For example, she was the first female barrister, as you heard, to defend in a murder trial, the first to appear as counsel in the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court. And as a junior, she developed a varied criminal and civil practice. But for the most part, it was her criminal practice which attracted the headlines. But she still had a very large civil practice, dealing with a wide range of cases, from sale of goods to personal injury to libel. And I remember when going through her papers to write her biography, you would see that she used to have a secretary to her sister, and she would have files of precedents in those days, obviously all in longhand or typescript, of all the various types of cases that she dealt with. And the range was really quite large. But of the more famous cases and of a civil nature, she represented Leary Constantine, the world famous cricketer, led by a famous advocate of the time, Sir Patrick Hastings QC. It was in what was probably the first anti-discrimination case, when he was barred from staying at a London hotel because he was black. She also appeared in the House of Lords without a leader against the then Attorney General, also a member of this inn, Hartley Shawcross, in a case called Adams and Naylor, a case concerning a young boy who'd been blown up by a landmine on sand dunes, which had been requisitioned by the Ministry of Defense. And the case is significant because it led to the Crown Proceedings Act, enabling the plaintiff to sue the Crown for the first time. Prior thereto, there had to be a representative defendant. And since the Crown Proceedings Act, it has all changed. And as a junior barrister, she even caught the attention of the then Lord Chief Justice, Lord Goddard, who had a fearsome reputation in a case about soap flakes called Dumbbell. It was a false imprisonment case. And of course, there were many cases like this because of wartime regulations that you were only allowed a certain amount of soap flakes or similar limitations on what you could have. And you may have heard more recently of the story about a male junior barrister in the House of Lords being asked to follow his late leader in a case where his leader had received a grilling. And the normal process or procedure or protocol is for the judges then to ask the junior, "Do you move?" At which point this male junior said, "Not without a crash helmet, my lord." Well, my mother must have had nerves of steel, because when this was asked of her by Lord Goddard, seeing that the case was being lost because her leader didn't understand the point, she addressed the court and, to quote Lord Goddard himself, who wrote to her afterwards to congratulate her, pulled the case out of the fire. By now, even though still only a junior barrister, she was becoming something of a local celebrity with invitations to speak. And she spoke then and subsequently on a wide range of issues, both relating to the law and to women, and also to other things. She spoke about the Convention on Human Rights and various things like that. And in 1945, she met and married my father. He was a general practitioner, and he was everybody in the press always called him a surgeon for some reason. And his first sighting of her was across a court in St. George's Hall. And they were engaged approximately 2 weeks later and married for over 60 years. And he lived here even after my mother passed away until he was almost 105. In 1949, just 10 years after being called to the bar, aged 34, and still the youngest ever, the third youngest ever, my mother was made the first female KC, was KC in those days too, jointly with Helena Normanton, who was over 20 years older than my mother. And she'd been the first female, I believe, to practice at the bar. Earlier that year, 3 months before she took silk, my mother became a mother. I'm an only child, and I can see you counting. Sadly, I cannot hide my age. Taking silk put my mother into a different league in every way. Helena Normanton retired a couple of years later. And although there were a handful of other women silks in the 1950s and 1960s, most went on to the county court bench. And by the end of the 1960s, my mother was still the only female QC practicing at the English bar. Taking silk had brought its challenges. For instance, in those days, once a barrister took silk, they not only had to move chambers to London, but they also had to live in London. And this obviously caused a problem for my mother, as my father's general medical practice was in Liverpool. So she was forced to have the ignominious task of making her plea to 12 male silks, then practicing in Liverpool, to ask if she could continue to live with her husband. They relented, provided she took her telephone number out of the telephone book, which she did. Such were the restrictive practices in 1949. And I remember when occasionally the press would get hold of our telephone number at home, she wouldn't answer the phone, or if she did, she pretended that she was her secretary. Once in silk, she was instructed in a string of very famous cases, both criminal and civil. But it was the criminal cases which hit the headlines, particularly murder cases, because in those days, a conviction for murder attracted capital punishment. The judge donned his black cap, and it was all very gruesome. Nonetheless, people would queue for hours to get into court in particularly notorious cases. Remember, in those days, there really wasn't much TV to the same extent as there is today, or certainly not social media or iPads or anything of that sort. And it was a sort of morbid form of entertainment. Additionally, in those days, people's interest was whipped up because the newspapers used to report the details of the cases almost like a transcript. So if it was a famous case, as many of my mother's were, there would often be full-page spreads of the cross-examination, particularly in the local newspapers where the trial was being heard. And in her murder trial, she saved several clients from the gallows, leading to press headlines such as Rose QC does it again, Rose Heilbron ends another brilliant case. So what of those cases? Let me start with the case that first made her name in silk and to which she referred throughout her life. It was called the Cameo trial. 9 months after taking silk, she defended George Kelly on a charge of double murder. And this was a brutal murder of 2 men at the Cameo Cinema in Liverpool one Saturday night, where they were shot point blank for some paltry takings of some 50-odd pounds. It was her first big case in silk, and she became the first female silk to defend in a murder trial. George Kelly, the defendant, was initially skeptical of her, being his counsel, allegedly complaining to another inmate, whoever heard of a Judy defending anyone? But as well as other clients skeptical of having a female barrister She soon won him over. The case really captured the public imagination, and queues snaked outside George's Hall, which was then where Liverpool courts were held, to enter the courtroom. Sometimes people, I remember my father telling me the story where somebody said, "Oh, I know Rose Heilbron," and Dad was waiting in the queue to get in to hear some case. And this woman didn't realize that she was talking to my mother's husband. And I think the story was not true. There were two trials for the Cameo case. In the first, my mother succeeded to the extent that the jury were unable to reach a verdict as they couldn't agree. But unfortunately, in the second trial, they split the indictment between Kelly, who was her client, and the co-accused. And Kelly was found guilty and ultimately hanged. But it is a fascinating case, and to this day, it's not known who actually killed the manager of the Cameo cinema and his deputy. And what is most interesting is what happened subsequently, because over 50 years later, it was discovered that the evidence that the prosecution had produced, some of it was fabricated, some of it hadn't been disclosed to the defense. And the conviction was quashed. Unfortunately, my mother wasn't well enough in those days to know. But there followed many other fascinating cases, not just in Liverpool, but all around the country, often attracting epithets. Let me start with the Bootle Bath murder case, where she successfully defended a French woman accused of murdering another lady who lived in the same house by drowning her in the bath. The defense was that there was another man with dark, hairy hands who was a visitor of the victim, visitor quote unquote, who was in fact the culprit. I don't think they ever found who actually murdered her, but she was saved from the gallows. Then there was the houseboat twins murder case, where her client was accused of murdering her twins by setting fire to her houseboat. And the allegation was that she wanted to get rid of the twins so that she could emigrate to Australia and live with her lover. She was acquitted of murder and found guilty of manslaughter. No doubt, with these words from my mother's final speech ringing in their ears, an example of her bringing a feminine angle to her work. There she was, going to be in her pajamas with her hair in curlers. Would she have gone to bed in curlers and then face firemen, police, etc., if she planned to set fire to the boat? Well, the jury obviously thought not. Then there was the Jack Spot trial. Jack Spot was a notorious London gangster who, when he was acquitted of wounding with intent another gangland affray to cause grievous bodily harm, he described her as the greatest lawyer in history, a compliment perhaps she would have preferred from someone else, not least because subsequently it was discovered that the parson who'd given evidence was actually on the take and had taken some money from Jack Spot to give false evidence. But of course, my mother nor his solicitor knew anything about this at the time. A final example, and there are many more, which I remember some, others I delved into when I was writing her biography, was the Dockers case. This was where my mother successfully defended Liverpool dockers who'd come out on strike and were charged with breaching certain regulations. And she was successful in getting them off. And it was a national strike, but she was representing the Liverpool dockers. And on her return to Liverpool Lime Street, which is the main station, from the Old Bailey where the trial was heard, a group of dockers was waiting for her at the station, apparently to serenade her along the platform. And one docker, who called himself Mersey Mike, even wrote her a poem. So there were many other great successes, but in some cases, like with every barrister, she was not successful. One such example was the wicked widow of Windy Nook. One Mary Wilson was accused of poisoning by phosphorus her second and third husbands, both elderly, in each case within 2 weeks of marrying them, for a paltry pension. She ran what I suppose you would now describe as the Viagra defense, namely that the phosphorus came from some euphemistically termed love pills, but the source was in fact rat poison. And the possibly, and I suspect more than possibly, apocryphal story goes that Mrs. Wilson was also parsimonious. Allegedly, at the wedding reception of her second prospective victim, she confided to a friend, "We'll keep the top tier of the wedding cake for the funeral." But my mother also had a very successful civil practice in silk, taking several cases to the Court of Appeal and the House of Lords. Her civil practice ranged from medical negligence to personal injury to other forms of contract law. She didn't do commercial law. That was in those days perhaps a bridge too far. But the novelty factor as a successful career woman and a young mother continued to attract huge press coverage, both locally, nationally, and internationally. She was asked to appear on shows like the Ed Murrow Show in America. And headlines such as "Housewife Who is Britain's Portia," "The Astonishing Rise of Rose Heilbron," "The Woman of the Year," are among some of the glowing articles written about her. And what was astonishing to me, reading all these press articles, was that in none of them was there any form of criticism. Publicity which celebrities today would literally die for, and all without any contact with the press. The press went into overdrive with many. In 1956, she became the first female recorder of Burnley. And although there'd been a stipendiary magistrate in the previous decade, doubtless because my mother was the first to wear a full-bottomed wig in a judicial capacity, she was always dubbed England's first female judge. And the press went into overdrive with many amusing cartoons, nowadays no doubt some politically incorrect, such as the picture of some old lag preening himself outside court with the caption, "Relax, Romeo, it's not m'lady, it's m'lud," and one of my mother dressed in a full-bottomed wig, leaning over the bench to her associate with the caption, "I washed it this morning and I can't do a thing with it." She appeared also in numerous articles about women. She received fan mail and all sorts of strange requests, from a photograph of her in a bathing suit to visiting a shop that made lace. One admirer, who would write in turquoise ink to his pin-up, told her after a case in which her client had been acquitted of murder that she shouldn't go around persuading juries that men are entitled to strangle their lady friends. In 1952, Margaret Thatcher wrote an article entitled "Wake Up Women," encouraging other women to follow in her path, combining marriage and a career. And Lord Carnarvon named a horse after her. We lost some money on that one. And all this without ever posing for a photograph or giving an interview or writing her life story, because in those days to do so would have been professional misconduct. And it is amazing now to think what the restrictions were, that without ever speaking to the press, she had this huge, huge press coverage. Her fame also brought her many invitations to speak. And as I said, this became obviously all the more so as she grew more famous, but she talked about law reform and women's issues well ahead of her time. She spoke in favor of equal pay for women. She always recognized that some women didn't want to have careers, and sometimes her speeches were reported in the papers with headlines such as, "Women should know what husbands earn, these wasted women. Equal pay soon, says woman KC." In 1972, she became the first woman to sit in the Old Bailey, and that too caused immense press coverage. And this was shortly after she'd opened her own chambers here in Gray's Inn. And what was perhaps surprising about her appearing in the Old Bailey was that professionally it wasn't a great step up, but there was something about having the first woman judge sitting in the Old Bailey that again captured people's imagination. It all arose because they stopped the quarter sessions. So my mother no longer was Recorder of Burnley, and you became a peripatetic recorder. And she was then asked to sit in the Old Bailey. And then there followed a string of other firsts, such as you've heard, first female commissioner of assize, first female bencher of this inn, first female leader of any circuit when she became leader of the Northern Circuit in 1973. And in 1974, the second female High Court judge. And then there were other things. She was made an honorary colonel of the Women's Royal Army Corps. And there were all sorts of things that people wanted her involved with. When she became a judge, she was assigned to the family division. And thus her cases, with one or two exceptions, didn't really hit the headlines. But by then she was 60 years of age. And she had to wait longer than she would have done as a man. Most men, even in those days, were appointed in their early to mid 50s. But this didn't prevent her, obviously, becoming the first female treasurer of any inn in 1985, nor chairing an important rate point in 1975, nor becoming the first female presiding judge on any circuit. And she retired in November 1988. But looking back on her life, which I did when I wrote her biography, because she kept everything. She knew there was a story there, but she couldn't write it. And what was interesting was important events. She wrote down notes in her handscript, which I was able to use in the biography. For example, when she was a young silk and the Queen had been on the throne only a year or so, she came to Liverpool. My mother wasn't on the receiving list, but suddenly the Queen, there was an announcement in the anteroom where my mother was with my father, the Queen wants to meet you. And so my mother went and met the Queen, I think then for the first time. And so she wrote that up. And so I had a first-hand account of how exciting that was in those days to be introduced to the Queen. And she met her on subsequent occasions for different reasons. And the other thing that I learned was the enormous energy that she had. After a day in court, she would get the midnight train up, say, to York or somewhere, doing a case, say, in the Court of Appeal in London, to do something the next day, or she would be giving a lecture of an evening. She had a huge stamina. And I don't know how sometimes she did it because she had a husband and a child. But of course, prejudice dogged her throughout her career. Her fame also no doubt brought jealousy. And she achieved her judicial preferment and other preferments much later than she would have done had she been a man. But she acknowledged, and she always said, women had to be patient. And she just got on with the job. Women, for example, were precluded from attending bar mess. This was the twice weekly dinners of barristers held during assizes, and judges' dinners until the mid-60s were also not available to her. And she would have to write to the judges to excuse her attendance, lest they thought her rude. And it was not until she became leader of the Northern Circuit in 1973 was she allowed to attend what is called Grand Court, for fear that female barristers might blush at the risque after-dinner stories. But she overcame it all. And when I read all the letters that were written to her at various milestones in her career, you could see that over the years, she had won them over, and they really, in some cases, were extremely fond of her. So women have come a long way since 1919, and what were really aspirations in my mother's day are, of course, now expectations. with so many female lawyers entering the profession. And she, I know, would have been thrilled to see so many women succeeding in the profession, and particularly at her beloved Gray's Inn. So let me end with her advocacy, because this is the theme of this lecture series. I only once heard my mother in court, and that was in a rather mucky divorce case. So I really don't have any personal recollection that I can offer you. But it is said that because of her reputation, juries hung on her every word. She was a fine natural advocate with a clear and strong voice, and used all the skills that she'd learned in her days of elocution and some acting, because she did some acting as a young girl, to modulate her voice, make use of the pause, and inspire juries and courts. It was not the Marshall Hall type of flamboyance, but clear and persuasive, coupled with a knack as to how to get to the heart of what juries or judges wanted to hear. As you heard in the houseboat case, she made use of the feminine touch, and she also had a very good legal brain. And she worked very hard. She worked often into the early hours, dictating final speech with a secretary who used to come to the house, and they would be drinking soup in the early hours of the morning to keep awake. And because when you're giving a final speech, as you know, you don't adjourn, you have to do it there and then. And her handwriting was large, and she was very fond of kaleidoscope of different pens. So I never quite worked out what each color meant, but the documents were annotated liberally. But ultimately, she had this natural and special talent, that sine qua non, which we cannot quite put a finger on, but we know it when we see it. And it was that which I suppose started when that solicitor said she would be a sensation in 5 years' time, to the end of her career as an advocate, and enabled her to create a successful career and to become what people say now was a great advocate, a great female advocate. And so it's been my great pleasure just to give you a tasting of her life. There's so much more. It's difficult to make a selection. Her biography has most of it in it. Those of you who want to read it, you will hear a lot more. But thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody may have. No questions. Yes? Well, I suppose she would list the cases that she'd done, the successes that she'd had. She was very humble. I would be surprised if she would want to say things too much about herself or blow her own trumpet. But I suspect she would just simply list her successes, as we all try to do in our profiles these days. I mean, it's a world, it's an era away, because you simply couldn't do that. I mean, even when I came to the bar, you couldn't go to solicitors' offices, you couldn't have visiting cards. So it's very, very different.
Thank you very much. Anybody down on the floor?
Yes. Up to.
Thank you very much for your talk. That was really inspirational and interesting. You said you didn't get to experience seeing your mother's advocacy style as much, but did you take inspiration for your own advocacy style, and how different is your advocacy style to hers?
Well, I didn't practice on the Northern Circuit, and I did a different type of law. So I didn't address juries, other than for the first couple of years of my practice, where I had 2 or 3 successes for bank managers' wives who were alleged to have stolen some goods from shops like Marks and Spencer, and I thought I would stop when I was doing well. So I didn't, it's a different type of advocacy to a judge, certainly, than it is for before a jury, which is probably where she made her name as a great advocate. It was her legal ability more in the courts. So I suppose, I think it's difficult to compare. The only time I did appear before her was on the last, when she retired. I had a word with the president of the family division, and with hindsight, I probably should have told her, but as a surprise, I stood up and said a few words on her retirement, and you could see the sort of tears welling up in her eyes. And I thought perhaps it was a bit hard to do it as a surprise, but she composed herself. But that's the only experience other than the divorce case.
Thank you again. Clearly, she was a lady of many firsts. Looking back at her career, what do you think she would have been most proud of?
I think probably blazing a trail and encouraging other women, because undoubtedly, for example, that I think 5 out of the 6 High Court judges after my mother were all from the Northern Circuit. And so I think she did. She lifted, people's ideas of what a woman could do as a working woman in the law. And I think she did encourage a lot of other women. And, I know of instances where she obviously helped other women get along the line. So I suspect, looking back and taking a broad picture, that would be a thing she would be particularly proud of.
Can I have one from online, if I may?
Yeah.
We have seen a lot of change already for women gaining equality in this industry. Do you think there is still room for improvement? And if so, how?
Well, that's moving away from my mother, but yet the answer is yes, obviously. There's still room for improvement. But I've said this for years, and that is the sheer force of talent and numbers that are coming into the profession will inevitably change things. It used to be said, well, there weren't many women judges, and that was because there weren't many women who were qualified in the sense of old enough or in silk or otherwise qualified to be judges. Now that's not a problem. So inevitably, it's going to change itself. I mean, I know people want it to happen more quickly, but it is now moving much more quickly, and given the numbers of women coming. So I think there obviously is still room for improvement, not just at the bar, but in probably more so even in solicitors. But I'm reasonably optimistic it will happen. There are always going to be difficult areas. You can't, one's just got to plod at it, really.
You've talked about your mother's successes and setbacks. I'm interested in hearing about how your mother dealt with setbacks and failures, especially as a working mother.
Well, in those days, you just took a deep breath, I'm afraid, and just got on with it. As she always used to say, that she was, had to be patient. I think she would have liked to have been a High Court judge earlier, but she wasn't, so she carried on at the bar. She got there in the end. So I don't think you could, she wasn't looking over her shoulder all the time. She just got on with it, and by sheer force of personality, of her ability, she made it. But it was much later. She, as I said, she only went on the bench when she was 60, which is late, even in those days.
You speak largely about your mother being the first at so many things. To be the first at so many things in such a period, you need a lot of resilience. Where do you think this resilience came from for your mother, and how can we implement that today?
Well, I think part of it was her personality, but she was lucky in that my father very much kept her feet on the ground. He had a lovely sense of humor. And he was also at home because his practice was at home. So when mum was traveling a bit, although not in the sense of going abroad very much, she went to Nigeria a couple of times, he was always there. And I think he was her rock, really, and her home life. She loved her home. And she just, as I said, just got on with it. Yes, she would be upset, but she didn't wallow in it. And she would, next, I mean, with cases, she always used to say to me, you know, you've got to say next, please. If you lose a case, you've got to then do the next one as best you can.
I appreciate you've spoken a lot about your mother's qualities and her talent, but what exactly is it that made her particularly unique in front of a jury?
Well, as I said, I can only give you the answer secondhand. I think it was her advocacy, because she was, I mean, she had a bit of an acting background, a modulated voice. She had an instinctive way of knowing what would appeal to juries. And as her reputation grew, they obviously listened more intently to what she said. And she didn't win them all, as I said. There was the widow of Windy North, but she did win a lot of cases by persuading juries and doing the hard graft, you know, working out the inconsistencies for the purpose of cross-examination. And you can see it in her notes. So I think it was a combination of hard work and natural talent.
Me that this has been a wonderful 45 minutes or so listening to Hilary telling us from a personal perspective about her mother, who I have to say has always been one of my great legal heroines. And it's just a joy. Hilary, thank you so much. It's been a very interesting, very stimulating talk. I'm sure that those who are in the room will have a chance to talk to Hilary and get the opportunity to get a little bit more of her insight during the course of the evening. But for the moment, on your behalf, may I ask you to